Hello, I'm Jason, doctor from Icelandic Roots. Welcome to our webinar series. Today we have with us Stefan Jonasson. He's the editor of Lögberg-Heimskringla, which is an English language newspaper serving the Icelandic community in North America. He's also an ordained Unitarian minister, past president of the Icelandic National League of North America, and he previously served as chair of the University of Winnipeg's Board of Regents. In addition to that, he's for many years served the Western Icelandic community and for that service has been awarded the Knight's Cross of the Icelandic Order of the Falcon in 2019. And he's with us today to talk about religion and Icelandic immigrants. 2024 marks the 150 years since Icelanders brought their families to settle in Gimli and Minnesota. Not only did they experience a marked change in the physical landscape, but also the religious landscape in the United States and Canada. And this is today's topic led by Reverend Jonasson, Religion in the New World. So thank you very much for being here. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate the invitation from Icelandic Roots and look forward to sharing just kind of the highest level summary of the religious life of Icelanders in North America. It's obviously a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and I should probably confess to being a religious partisan in the sense that I'm an ordained Unitarian minister. But I've studied Icelandic religion both in Iceland itself, or the Icelandic phenomenon, and religion among the Icelanders in North America with a broader perspective. And so I actually deeply appreciate the rich diversity of religious expression among the Icelanders in North America, and actually the growing religious diversity of Icelanders back home in Iceland. In the essay that I wrote for Icelandic Roots, I opened with a quotation from Þórbergur Þórðarson, who's one of my favorite Icelandic authors. He was himself a theosophist. So he was not part of the prevailing religious culture of Iceland. He was also devoted to Esperanto as a language and had many other interesting quirks. But he was a brilliant and much beloved writer in Iceland. And nearly a century ago, he wrote that Icelanders have always been, and still are to this day, divertingly apathetic in religious matters, amazingly free from ecclesiastical dogmas, and rather indifferent to Christian missionaries and other kinds of fanaticism. Generally speaking, he added, they are rationalists. There are many people in this country, nonetheless, who have a contemplative leaning to mysticism and a psychic sensitivity to invisible powers. My compatriots' capabilities, however, are most often free from any specific religious ideology or ecclesiastically backed dogmas. And they are usually manifested in a contemplative curiosity mingled with the shade of mysticism born along with a groundswell of emotions free of extremism. Whew. It's a lot to digest, and it sets the landscape really for understanding Icelandic religiosity, and it both overstates some aspects and understates others. I actually believe that beyond Þórbergur's generalization, the reality of Icelanders' appreciation of religion is that actually there is a greater fondness for religion than his remarks may have suggested. But he also sets the stage, I think, for what confuses many people about Icelandic religion. On the one hand, today Iceland is arguably one of the most secular countries in the world. On the other hand, we hear repeated reports about Icelanders believing in hidden people and spiritual phenomena and valuing their dreams. And so there's this kind of these mixed signals that come from Iceland today. And those mixed signals were already present at the time of the immigration to North America. And they are embodied to some degree in how religious life unfolded in Icelanders' new home. It also hints, though, including Huldafolk and Icelandic folklore, and even the saga tradition as part of the background for Icelandic religion. I think it shows that there is always at play what might be called a folk religion among the Icelanders that crosses traditional denominational boundaries, and that actually defies the sense that somehow there was a heterodoxy in Iceland, first during the Catholic era and then during the predominantly Lutheran era, that excluded other forms of religious expression. At no time in Icelandic history has religion held an exclusive hold over the Icelandic people. And even during the era where there was one church and one church only, the varieties of religious expression varied, both practices and ideas among the Icelandic people. And what happened in the course of the immigration is that tendency towards heterodoxy, towards differing views, was unleashed. And Icelanders found themselves in an environment that granted greater permission and, in some sense, a certain obligation to express religion in varied forms. So that's sort of the background of the people who came here. And they brought those tendencies and those religious beliefs with them that they knew back home. And those beliefs, that tendency, the broadness of the Church of Iceland, which has always been part of the broad church tradition in religious circles, that actually came into conflict with the environment that they arrived in, where there was more sectarianism, more religious division, where religion became very closely connected with ethnicity in a manner that would have been irrelevant back home in Iceland, where there was one people. And so it helps to explain how religion eventually evolved in the New World. It would be fair to say that at least since the Lutheran Reformation, but probably before, Icelanders were adept at ignoring religious beliefs and practices that didn't speak to them. And because they were literally on the edge of the Christian world, it was easy to do that. It frankly would have been too expensive for religious authorities elsewhere, both materially and spiritually, to try to correct the Icelanders and the ways in which they differed from practices found on the European continent. The dominance of the state church in Iceland was also a factor that led to a bit of a crisis among the Icelandic people here in North America when they emigrated and there was no state church. There were in some places what were essentially de facto dominant religious movements, but there was no state church to depend upon. And among other things, this created a financial obligation on the part of Icelanders to which they had been unaccustomed. Back home, they were taxed to support the church. And here in North America, they were obligated to actually establish their own congregations, their own denominational institutions, and to support them with their own money. This in time over the decades became one of the sources of conflict between the Lutherans and the Unitarians, because the Lutherans were really on their own. They organized an Icelandic Evangelical Lutheran Synod. They relied on their own resources, and that's all they had to work with. Whereas those who gravitated towards the Unitarians found themselves in the enviable position of actually receiving significant subsidies from wealthy people back in New England, who believed that, according to one president of the American Unitarian Association, believed that Scandinavians, who they considered Icelanders to be a part of, that Scandinavians were more easily cultivated in the New England habit of mind than other immigrant groups, which is just a manifestation of, I suppose, the greatest regional snobbery imaginable, but I also understand what they meant. So leaving behind the dominance of the state church and arriving here on their own, the Icelanders had to look after themselves. They had to become self-sufficient religiously rather than have the standards opposed to them. And that really led to all of the subsequent developments and to the emergence of what I like to call a mixed bouquet. Tremendous religious diversity among the Icelandic people in North America, although until the last generation or two, the Lutheran Church continued to be the dominant expression of organized religion among the Icelandic people. So where I'm going to go now is going to be necessarily siloed in fashion. I debated whether to do this chronologically or by religious category, and decided it would be easier to tell the story to those who may be familiar with it by actually following the silos that developed among Icelanders here. I also need to acknowledge that my presentation has a certain Winnipeg-centric bias, primarily because it's easier to tell the story by referring to some local developments and conditions. But it's also the case that Winnipeg really was the cultural center of the Icelandic community until about the Second World War. In fact, it's the period between the First and Second World Wars in which the Icelandic community becomes distinctly Canadian or American in flavor, distinctly Midwestern, continental, and West Coast. So those geographic silos emerged during the interwar period, but it's really around 1940 that those changes are complete, and Winnipeg loses its place as both the spiritual and political and cultural capital of the Icelandic people here. So I just want to acknowledge that up front in case you're in Thingvalla Township or off in Nebraska, and you don't hear your community mentioned. But we need to backtrack a bit, because before the major immigration of the Icelanders, which really began in 1870 and accelerated in 1874 and 1875, before that, the first group of Icelanders, there may have been an individual Icelander or two who managed to find their way to North America, but the first group of Icelanders to come to North America were in fact people who had been converted to Mormonism back in Iceland in the 1850s. And they began to leave Iceland in 1855 on their way to Zion, the Mormon or Latter-day Saint Holy Land in Utah. There's really no other way to describe it. They came primarily from the south of Iceland, from Rangárvallasýsla and from Vestmannaeyjar. And Mormonism in Iceland, to the extent that it existed, continued to be concentrated in that area until perhaps 2 generations ago. And so they were converted. They saw the possibilities of life in a new land, and they left Iceland for Utah, eventually settling in Spanish Fork. The interesting thing, there was never a distinct Icelandic Mormon church. So while there are today 3 Mormon congregations in Iceland, and actually a 4th congregation that meets in Spanish in Iceland, which is interesting to see. In North America, they didn't settle and establish Mormon congregations. They settled and participated in multi-ethnic congregations in Spanish Fork, where they settled, where in fact they were drawn because of the previous Danish settlement in that area. And the group mostly kept to themselves in terms of the Icelandic community when the major emigration began. But they made overtures out. In 1879, for instance, the Mormons sent missionaries to Winnipeg to try to win over the settlers here who had been here for 4 years at that time, and they held an open air meeting advocating for the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were not well received. Around about the same time, they sent missionaries back to Iceland, and they were not received well there either. Although later Mormonism did get a foothold in Iceland itself. But otherwise, it was a pretty isolated phenomenon in Utah. There, as I say, there'd never been a distinctly Icelandic congregation there, and eventually, some of the people who had immigrated under Mormon auspices broke away to form or return to the Lutheran Church, and so a Lutheran Church was established in Spanish Fork, and I suspect that in the early years, there may have been as many Icelanders in the Lutheran Church in Spanish Fork as there were embracing Mormonism, although the consequences of natural population increase shifted that in favor of Icelanders in Utah embracing Mormonism. It's also, and I'm going to move on very quickly from here, but it's probably also important to note that the immigration to Utah, even though it's widely known today, and there are many Icelandic people in the state of Utah, the actual immigration from Iceland was far smaller than the migration to Brazil that commenced about a decade later. Although Brazilian Icelandicness is less obvious today than Icelandicness is in Utah, partly because some people went back to Iceland, partly because they just blended in with the larger population more clearly. So that's the first religious expression found among the Icelanders in this continent. And we'll move on from there to the Lutherans, which was obviously the natural religious tradition for the Icelanders in the New World to embrace. And so most Icelanders who have come to North America arrived here as Lutherans. And there was the legendary religious disputation between Reverend Jón Bjarnason and Reverend Páll Thorlaksson in New Iceland, when people weren't yet living in permanent homes, and they were arguing over religion. I have come to believe that the seeds for that disputation, and in fact the seeds for religious division among the Icelandic people, were set by Taylor, the government agent who oversaw the the movement of the Icelanders to Manitoba. He was a deeply religious man. And it was actually in reading Bodvar Gudmundsson's novel Where the Winds Dwell, which is not history, but is probably one of the most brilliant historical novels ever written. It was in reading that I came to reinterpret Taylor's influence on the Icelandic community and came to understand that he saw himself as a Moses figure, and that he too was leading people to a promised land, although the Icelanders themselves coming were driven by secular considerations rather than religious ones. But Taylor, being a devout person whose faith tradition was not the same as the Icelanders, in a sense set the stage for the seeds of the division that would occur. And we see it first in this legendary dispute between Jón Bjarnason and Páll Thorlaksson, where Jón is the liberal at that time. He later migrated across the spiritual spectrum, if there is such a thing. But at the beginning, he was the liberal, and Reverend Páll was viewed as more conservative. Although it would be fairer to Reverend Páll to say he was more American already, and that he had embraced to a greater degree the Lutheranism of the Germans and the Norwegians, having received his theological education on this continent, whereas Reverend Jón had been educated entirely in Iceland, and he brought with him the understanding of the Icelandic Church. And so, in some ways, what separated them, in had more to do with secular considerations related to how they should seek to live in the New World than it did to doctrinal matters. Although doctrinal matters were significant.
Can you speak a little bit on that? Because I know when I go to Canada and people talk about this, I get more of this, that it was a religious difference. But when in the United States, people view it more, Páll Thorlaksson as more of a social worker who took all the disenfranchised people to the United States.
I think that when you look at who followed Reverend Páll to North Dakota, I think that confirms that the American perception of the story is more correct. That you have Stefan G. Stephenson, you have Oliver Olafsson from Espehol following Reverend Páll. These are not religious conservatives, in any measure, and they just concluded that he had a better understanding of how the Icelanders could adapt to North American society than Reverend Jón did, and so in that sense, the movement was in some ways a secular one, although the doctrinal argument eventually won the day. So I would say today that the remnants of Lutheran congregations in Canada are more liberal in theology than the remnants of Icelandic Lutheran congregations in the United States.
I see.
And so there's what leads people in the first place is not necessarily what develops over the course of time. So there's a bit of a both and answer to that.
Yeah.
Although the people that migrated to North Dakota were reacting largely to the horrible conditions in swampy New Iceland at the time, and Oliver Olafsson famously said that he was drawn to the mountain area because it reminded him of Iceland, which I never fully appreciated until I visited where he lived in Iceland and understood even the orientation to the sun is remarkably similar. So here in North America, you have first a sermon actually in Milwaukee at the time of the millennial celebration, preached by Jón Bjarnason. And then you have a 3-year gap before he preaches in Winnipeg in Grace Methodist Church in the Sunday school room to a congregation of Icelanders who gathered there. And then the following year in 1878, the Trinity congregation is organized. And Jón Bjarnason is the minister for a short time before leaving Manitoba to work in the United States and actually return to Iceland for a time. So the congregation was founded and, in effect, abandoned in terms of ministry, and kind of stumbled along. They had Halldór Briem for a time as their minister, and carried on. And it wasn't until I think 1883 or so that Jón returned to Winnipeg, and Trinity congregation was reorganized as a Lutheran congregation. Before that had happened, though, we have congregations being organized at Garthar and at Mountain in North Dakota. And the organization of the Garthar congregation, which was organized under the leadership of Reverend Paut, shows again the cleavage that's going to eventually emerge among the Icelanders, because Stefan G. Stephenson, the poet, he was still Stefan Gudmundsson at the time, was the secretary of the organizational meeting, and he declined to sign the minutes. And when Reverend Paut challenged him, he said that he objected to 2 provisions in the constitution of the congregation. One being that the congregation didn't extend the right to vote to women in the church itself. It had in fact been the practice that in church matters, women in Iceland were eligible to vote from 1828 already. So the role of, it was more than a century later before there were any ordained women in Iceland. But the idea that women were somehow had membership in the church that was derivative from the membership of their husbands and fathers and brothers was offensive to Stefan G. And so he declined to sign the minutes. And it was only when Reverend Paut gave him permission to record his dissent that he then signed the organizing minutes as the secretary of the congregation. This is significant.
Pardon my ignorance on this, but you mentioned that in Iceland women could vote.
Yes.
Since 1828, but was this something from the Norwegian Synod that women couldn't vote?
That's precisely what was going on. So very early on, the Icelandic Lutherans here begin trying to conform themselves to the Norwegian standard, which was actually far more, I don't even know that conservative is the right word. It was different from what people knew in the Church of Iceland. And so they had a different sensibility about religion, including whether or not women had a role, an active leadership role in the life of the congregations. The Norwegian Synod prohibited it. The German Lutherans, primarily through the Missouri Synod, were even more rigid on the matter. And these are the people who had educated Reverend Paut, whereas Stefan G was bringing with him an understanding of church that he learned in Iceland. And so he and others objected. And this initial challenge led to certain developments. One is that when the Icelandic Lutheran Synod was organized in 1885, there was substantial dissent on 2 matters: about whether to call the church Lutheran, where a significant minority, between a quarter and a third of the delegates attending the synod, advocated for just calling it the Christian Church or the Church of Iceland in America, rather than using the Lutheran name. And the second opposition was again over whether or not women could have the vote in church matters and sit on church boards and attend the synod as delegates. And the group that objected to the exclusion of women and to the denominational name then constituted the group of individuals who 6 years later organized a Unitarian congregation in Winnipeg. So it's the very gathering of the first convention of the Icelandic Lutheran Synod that leads to the emergence of Unitarianism among the Icelanders as a reaction to the decisions that were made at that convention. And I'm persuaded that not even the leaders of the Lutheran Synod agreed with the decision that was made.
Yeah.
But because they were seeking to cultivate relations with other Lutherans in North America, they acquiesced to it. And it proved to be something that then divided the Icelandic
So
community.
what you're saying is that Reverend Jon probably wanted women to vote, given that was his experience in Iceland,
yes.
but that he acquiesced to the larger Lutheran community in North America.
Because by that point, they're already trying to reconcile the Dakota Territory congregations and the Manitoba congregation, along with the standards of the Norwegian Synod, which was ultimately going to be training the ministers for the new body. So it was a major factor. And until then, one can argue that the Lutheran Church was the primary organization, both religious and secular, among the Icelandic people. There were, organizations that developed, like the Progressive Society, for instance, but they didn't have the sway in the community that the church did. Once you have two significant religious movements among the Icelanders, then the church ceases to be a bonding agent for the whole Icelandic community. So, it lasted for a decade and a half, and then people started looking to alternative organizations to heal the breach. So, for instance, it's the organization of the IOGT, the Good Templars, was partly driven by a desire to have an Icelandic organization that transcended the religious division. It didn't entirely succeed because you ended up in Winnipeg with two Good Templars lodges operating, divided often on religious and political differences. The other thing that the other thing is that arguably the Icelandic National League might have never been created if Icelanders hadn't divided into Lutherans and Unitarians first, because it would have been less necessary, perhaps even unnecessary, as an institution to bring Icelandic people together. It's possible that the growing forces of secularism might have still led to its development, but there was the added incentive of taking Icelanders who had become divided by political parties and divided by religious communities back into a single community where political and religious questions didn't prevent them from sitting at the same table together.
I brought this up to you in email as one of my questions, is because many of my friends who are Greek, they get most of, they're very, as you know, Greek people are very interested in their heritage and in the long history, much longer than our history, their literature, their language, and they get most of that through the Greek Orthodox Church here in the United States and not through secular Greek organizations, which is difference, yeah.
And in a curious sort of way, I've sometimes heard Icelandic described as the Latin of the North. And one could also describe Iceland as the Greece of the North
Yeah,
in terms of
absolutely.
historical traditions. And curiously, alongside the church in the Greek tradition, you have the Greek philosophical tradition, which carries on without organization,
Hmm.
but continues to the present day in the memory and minds of the people. In a similar way, the saga tradition and the Eddas occupy a similar role among Icelanders, that there was this other source of learning and wisdom
Yeah.
that came to the Icelanders, and in some ways undermined the power of the church at times,
Hmm.
because Icelanders came to know that there were actually multiple ways of being in the world and multiple traditions to convey from the past. Anyway, uh, to return to my narrative, in from 1886 until 1891, there is a Unitarian mission among the Icelanders, partly inspired by Christopher Jansen, a Norwegian poet who had migrated and spent 10 years living in North America. He actually was one of the 4 poet laureates of Norway, and he resigned a very lucrative pension as poet laureate to come to North America as a Unitarian minister. And so he was working in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and in Hanska down in Brown County, across the river in Hudson, Wisconsin. And Bjorn Peterson, who had been one of the individuals involved in the Icelandic Cultural Society, which also had certain religious components, in that it was a reaction to Lutheran Orthodoxy, organized in the guise of a reading society. And so Björk was part of that phenomenon, organized by Stefan G. Stephenson. And at the same time, he became aware of the Unitarians, as had Stefan G. and others, because Unitarianism can actually trace the awareness of Unitarianism can be traced back to pretty much the beginning of the 19th century in Iceland. And so he's sent out as a Unitarian missionary to visit the Icelandic communities. He and Jon Bjarnason are personal friends, but they write some of the most horrible things about one another in the Icelandic publications, because they're bitterly opposed on the question of religion. And eventually, in 1891, or actually in 1890, Bjorn, who was a widowed man, married the head of the Unitarian Post Office mission in St. Paul. And the condition of their marriage was that instead of roving around the Icelandic communities talking about Unitarianism, he had to settle down in one place and establish a church. And that one place happened to be Winnipeg. And so they established the first Icelandic Unitarian Society, an interesting choice of name, here in Winnipeg. And that's the religious division that most Icelandic people today are aware of. The church grew under his leadership. At the same time, Reverend Magnus Skaptason in the New Iceland area preached against the doctrine of hell, which led to a schism in the synod and some of his congregations following him out of the synod. And although he had had no contact with Unitarians before then, he had read Unitarian authors, and eventually the Unitarian Association sent an emissary to meet with Magnus Skaptason, and so his followers ended up also gravitating in to the Unitarian Church. And you have, for a very brief period of time, you have a period where it's hard to tell who's dominant, the Unitarians or the Lutherans. It did not last for long. I mean, by the middle of the 1890s, The Lutherans are clearly back in the driver's seat, and the Unitarian movement is a minority movement. But through those two developments, the organization of a congregation in Winnipeg and the religious split through what was called Magnus Skaptison's Easter Sermon, although Lutherans called it that sermon and Unitarians called it the Great Sermon. So, how
funny.
people talked about it reflected what their bias was. But you then have in the middle of the 1890s a clearly established Unitarian movement among the Icelanders, and that's followed by a third way. And that's a group known as the Winnipeg Tabernacle, which didn't have anything exactly similar in the rural communities, other than perhaps the Quill Lakes Church in Wynyard, Saskatchewan. And so the Winnipeg Tabernacle was organized by a young minister, Reverend Hafstein Peterson, who was actually more conservative in theology than Jon Bjarnason. It was organized originally as the Second Lutheran Congregation in Winnipeg, but it adopted the name Tjaldbúðin, or Tabernacle, because Hafstein Peterson had been inspired by Charles Spurgeon, who was the leader of the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, which was a Baptist congregation, actually. And so the Tabernacle develops, they build a building of their own. Back at First Lutheran Church, the congregation passes a resolution calling upon its members not to join the Tabernacle and essentially not to associate with the Tabernacle, which is actually the second case of religious shunning in the Icelandic community. The first case was in Minnesota, Minnesota, where the minister admonished members of the congregation, supported by the board, not to associate with Björn Peterson, the Unitarian missionary. Well, for a second time that happens, only in this case, the minister is a fairly Orthodox Lutheran of a Danish mold. And he served the church, from its founding in 1894 until just about the turn of the century, when he left for Denmark. And while while he was away, the congregation was without a leader until Reverend Friedrich Bergman was enticed to leave Garthar, North Dakota, where he had a reputation for being on the conservative spectrum, again, more conservative than Jon Bjarnason. And when I say conservative here, I'm referring to theology, and I'm referring to North American standards of theology. So Reverend Friedrich came to Winnipeg in 1901 to be the first instructor in Icelandic at Wesley College, which is now the University of Winnipeg. And at the same time, he took the pulpit of the Tabernacle. In Winnipeg, his theological position evolved fairly rapidly over the course of about the first 5 years, which Reverend Friedrich attributed to his having more time to read and study religion, in addition to teaching Icelandic at the university and serving a relatively robust congregation. The Tabernacle grew under his leadership. By 1906, he preached a sermon called The Letter and the Spirit, in which he denied the plenary inspiration of the Bible, and in which he said that the creeds were actually just milestones in the evolution of the church, but they weren't binding. And so, having effectively theologically kneecapped both the Bible and the creeds, he essentially emerged as probably the most liberal among the Icelandic ministers, even when compared to the Unitarians. And so then the tabernacle continued to grow and prosper. In 1916, Reverend Friedrich and Reverend Rugvelder Peterson, who had arrived as minister of the Unitarian congregation, entered into negotiations to amalgamate the two churches into a single congregation. And although Reverend Friedrich didn't live to see that happen, the amalgamation was accomplished in 1920. Before then, even some congregations had withdrawn from the Lutheran Synod to follow Reverend Friedrich and his teachings, which were called the New Theology. In that, he actually reflected currents back home in Iceland. So this was a re-energizing of Icelandic religion here in North America with a new Icelandic influence that was distinctly more open and liberal in theology. And so some congregations withdrew from the synod. If you're a member of a congregation that withdrew from the Icelandic Lutheran Synod between 1909 and 1921, then you can pretty much count that they were followers of Reverend Friedrich and the New Theology, even though they may have gravitated back towards conventional Lutheranism.
Mm-hmm.
The outside of Winnipeg, the strongest place, the place where this was felt most strongly was in Wynyard, Saskatchewan, where the congregation remained outside the Lutheran Synod and eventually joined what became known as the United Conference of Icelandic Churches, and that they were sometimes called the Federated Churches, because by then the word United Church had already been taken. So they were known as the Federated Churches, and they frankly included people all the way from Unitarians to those who still identified as Lutherans. So it was a very broad church basis. The Federated Churches were mostly served by Lutheran ministers who came from Iceland, including Jakob Jonsson, who later returned to become the first minister of Hallgrímskirkja in Reykjavik. And actually, during this period, there's a certain rapprochement between the leaders of the Unitarian and then Federated churches and the Icelandic Lutheran churches. And that went so far as for Reverend B.B. Jonsson in Winnipeg to imagine that if the Lutheran Synod were to decide to enter the United Church of Canada, which had been founded a decade earlier, instead of remain a Lutheran Synod, that the Unitarians would follow, and that the Icelandic community might return again to having a single denominational body.
So let me stop you for a sec, because I have a lot of questions about this, but I was waiting for you to talk about how the national church in Iceland figured in, and it sounds like this federation of churches was a feeder for people trained in the national church, at least, to come to North America and sort of try to maybe in the 1920s rebuild the religious side of the Icelandic community, or the religious aspect of their life. And can you talk a little more about that and how the national church figured into this?
I can, and there's one particular symbolic way in which it does. I do think that by the time Reverend Friedrich is preaching the New Theology, he's preaching the dominant theological position of the Church of Iceland at the time. So by the beginning of the 20th century, the Church of Iceland, which had already been a broad church, became even more inclusive and opening. And so once the federation occurs, once the New Theology congregations and the Unitarians come together, the Bishop of Iceland started sending greetings to church conferences. This is a singular symbolic act that indicated that by the 1920s, the Church of Iceland had essentially adopted the position that the Church of Iceland in America And of course, they never referred to Canada. So it was the Church of Iceland in America was divided, and that they were in communion with both the Evangelical Icelandic Lutheran Synod and the United Conference of Icelandic Churches. And because most of the ministers of the United Conference were, in fact, Church of Iceland ministers, there was just a natural affinity that went back and forth. Beyond that practice of sending greetings to the United Conference, conventions, it was called United Conference because what they did was conferences, among other things. In addition to sending greetings to those meetings, it's also the case that some of the Church of Iceland ministers were ordained here in North America under Unitarian Church or Federated Church auspices, and they were not required to be ordained when they returned to Iceland to serve congregations there.
Interesting.
Their ordination was recognized as valid. And that fact also says to me that the Church of Iceland, recognized both religious communities in North America. And that changed finally in 1953, when the last bishop to send greetings to the United Conference sent his greetings in a very, elaborate leather-bound document with calligraphic scroll for the text. It's a work of art as a document, but it was the last time he sent greetings, because that year the United Conference voted to transform itself into the Western Canada Unitarian Conference. And once it reclaimed the Unitarian label again and made its affiliation clear, which it did in order to be open to all the other Unitarian congregations in Western Canada that existed, to be a common denominational body. Once that happened, then the Church of Iceland stopped sending greetings. It was also a case that the bishop changed, and the Church of Iceland reverted to a different policy. From that point on, pretty much all of the Church of Iceland ministers who come to North America come to serve Lutheran congregations in Manitoba, the Dakotas, and North Dakota, and Washington State. So there's a clear change in policy by that.
But also, the Lutheran Church has probably changed a lot since it had been in the 1880s in terms of its policies, right? Is that
absolutely?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So
that's so fascinating. And today there's a Lutheran World Federation. I don't know if there was back in the 1880s or when they first arrived.
There was a Lutheran World Federation, and I actually suspect they met in Winnipeg in the 1990s, and I was unable because I was traveling, but I was invited to speak at the Lutheran World Federation meeting in Winnipeg. I think it's clear that it came to this city because of the influence of the Church of Iceland. That the affinity of the Church of Iceland for the remnant of the Icelandic Unitarian Synod was, I suspect, a factor in the decision to bring the Lutheran World Federation here. But the existence of the Lutheran World Federation also pulled back the Church of Iceland from what might be called some of its theological accommodation towards other religious communities among the Icelanders. So the presence of or the Icelandic engagement in world Lutheran affairs had both a push and pull effect
Mhm.
in terms of how the Church of Iceland responded to Icelandic Lutherans in North America. So
That's so interesting. I'm just it's just fascinating to me that it seemed like there was sort of radio silence from Iceland with the first Lutheran church, or is that incorrect? And then
no,
with the new
no, there were
theology, there became these communications.
among the phenomena that we see is that when the Bishop of Iceland, different bishops,
Mhm.
visited over the course of the years,
Okay.
and on more than one occasion, the bishop would preach in both the Lutheran and the Unitarian Church in
Okay.
and so but there wasn't radio silence in the sense that particularly, you know, among the evangelical Icelandic Evangelical
Mhm.
Lutheran Synod from the time of its foundation until the time it had its last convention in 1962. The Church of Iceland was in regular relationship
Okay.
with the
Okay.
the Lutheran Synod. So there wasn't radio silence. Far from it.
Okay. Okay.
There
Good.
were
I understand.
robust relations, and of course, then that also extended to the Unitarians and New Theology congregations during that 30-year period in the largely the second quarter of the 20th century. I'm mindful of the time,
Yeah.
uh, so I want to just draw people's attention to the fact that while my presentation today has kind of focused on both the tensions and the affinity of the Lutherans and the Unitarians and that third component, the new theology, there's also a considerable amount of religious diversity among the Icelandic population in North America that I point to in the essay that I wrote for Icelandic Roots, which people can read at the newsletter site. And in some cases, there were influences that came from Iceland. In other cases, people here had an influence on Iceland. So the existence of Pentecostalism in Iceland today largely depends on Icelanders from North America who transmitted it back to the old country, and United States military personnel who brought it with them beginning during the Second World War. Similarly, the Baha'i faith in Iceland partly owes its existence today to the first Fjallkona, Sigrun Lindahl, who presided at the Icelandic Festival 100 years ago this year, and about 15 years later became one of the founding members of the Baha'i faith here in Winnipeg, and later moved to the United States and became what amounts to a Baha'i missionary. I'm sure they would use different language in California and the Caribbean. But also at the same time influenced the emergence of the Baha'i faith in Iceland. And I have to say, one of my favorite characters was a fellow called Siggy Biblia, who was a devoted person. The first person I can find since before the conversion of Iceland who described himself with the term missionary, who lived half of the year in Winnipeg and half of the year in Iceland, where he sold Bibles in the heart of Reykjavik and other religious tracts. He's a fascinating figure. There's also Björn Johansson, who grew up in Akron, North Dakota, who became a Swedenborgian minister at the Church of the New Jerusalem, and actually went on to become a professor in their theological school. And for 12 years, he was the editor of the Church of the New Jerusalem's national newspaper in the United States. And then there's the interesting figure, Adelstein. Wouldn't you know, I'm going to blank on his name. Adelstein Johnson, who grew up in Minnesota and became the head of the Congregationalist Church in Iowa State, a role he held for decades. So there's this rich diversity that flows. And today, I'm convinced that neither Lutherans nor Unitarians, certainly not Unitarians, are the most common religious group represented among the Icelandic people in North America. I suspect that most Icelanders have become thoroughly secularized on this continent, as they have back home in Iceland. And in the absence of a state church, there's no reason for them to declare any religious affiliation. But I think that if we could get the hard data, we would find that the United Church of Canada has eclipsed both denominations on this side of the border, and that it's likely only in the United States where the Lutherans may still be the dominant religious expression. But even there, I suspect that through intermarriage and other factors, most Icelanders have, like every other American, come to embrace the religion that makes sense to them. And that in that sense, on both sides of the border, our community has become thoroughly assimilated into the larger population. And as groups like the Icelandic National League of North America and the Icelandic National League of the United States and Icelandic Roots that have become increasingly important in bringing the Icelandic community together.
Well, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I want to give one time for if anyone has a question online. You actually answered all the questions I had pre-set out for you.
I'm sorry.
No, that's great. It's good. You covered a lot of ground, and it was I learned an incredible amount. And it's complicated. There's a lot of it's multidimensional. There's theology, and then there's what the people experiencing their freedom want, and there's the identity of being an Icelander and how that all figures in with your choice of religion, and how the religious bodies communicate and how they support each other. It's really fascinating.
And I would say that too often our conversations about the religious history of the Icelanders usually begin with those who are people of faith approaching it from the prejudice of their own tradition.
Yes.
Sometimes focusing the story on grievances that are decades old, and probably neglecting to see that actually Thorbergur Þórðarson is mostly right in terms of Icelanders having become secularized. And in many ways, Unitarians and Lutherans and even Mormons and other religious groups among the Icelanders have more in common with one another in terms of maintaining a society in which religion is still important than they do with the secular majority in both Iceland and North America.
Well, this Federation of Churches seemed to be kind of a promising development, because it did kind of bring people together from different churches. And
it was, and I do think that if B.B. Jonsson died in 1938, and his successor, Dr. Valdemar Elands, a brilliant biblical scholar, was opposed to any approachment between the denominations, although in Winnipeg, he and the Unitarian minister were good friends and on good terms. But he objected to seeking to bring the communities back together again. I think that if B.B. Jonsson, Bjorn B. Jonsson, had lived for another decade, that actually both the Icelandic Unitarian body and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod might have ended up as part of the United Church of Canada.
That's really interesting.
And in the end, they probably won most of our individual members anyway.
Yeah, that's true. But without any sort of representation related to
That's right.
Iceland, right? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an incredible learning experience for me, and I know for a lot of our members, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. It's been fun. I tried very hard
You did an incredible job.
to fit things into the time allotted, but it's a huge subject.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.